Hello, Comics Alternative fans. Before we start with the episode, we want to invite all of you to check out our Patreon campaign.
That's right. Go to www.patreon.com/comicsalternative for more details. There you'll find more information about the campaign and the cool rewards levels we have.
For as little as $1 a month, you can help us maintain good quality comics talk, and the more you contribute, the more perks you get.
These include monthly podcast episodes exclusive to Patreon supporters, as well as the chance to help us choose which books we review on the show. So be sure to visit www.patreon.com/comicsalternative and become one of our proud podcast patrons.
Yeah, and now on with the show.
This is the Comics Alternative, episode 141, reviews of Grip, The Strange World of Men, Little Nemo, Return to Slumberland, and Providence, #1.
Countdown for blast off. X-5, 4, 3, 2, X-1, fire.
Hello and welcome to another episode of the Comics Alternative. I'm Derek.
And I'm Andy, and we're two guys with PhDs talking about comics.
And on this episode of the review show, we're going to be looking at 3 new titles. First, we're going to be looking at a, I guess, somewhat new work from Gilbert Hernandez, Grip, The Strange World of Men, and I'll explain later what I meant by sort of new. After that, we're going to be discussing the first trade from Eric Shanower and Gabriel Rodriguez, Little Nemo, Return to Slumberland. And then finally, we're going to wrap up with issue number 1 of Providence, written by Alan Moore with art by Jacen Burrows. But before we get to those titles, we want to let all of you know that this episode of the Comics Alternative is brought to you by the wonderful folks at Discount Comic Book Service. Go to their website, dcbservice.com, for all of your comics pre-ordering needs. There you'll find that they have DC, Marvel, Image, and Dark Horse titles at 40% off the cover price if you pre-order. For all of the other publishers, you'll find that those discounts are 20 to 35% off cover price, and every single month you're going to find some incredible specials. Sometimes those specials are going to be at 45% off cover price, sometimes at 50% off cover price, but many times the discounts go even higher from there.
And as we've all come to expect from DCB Service, there are tons of bundles that you can take advantage of. I mean, DC Kids bundles, DC Returning series, new series, Valiant bundles, Vertigo bundles, and these are all at 50% off. And you know, Derek, the great thing about this is, you know, we just got back from HeroesCon, where there are always a lot of great deals at cons, right?
Right.
But these deals on DCB Service, they're there all the time.
And you know, something else about us being out of town, I am probably going to be late with my orders this month, but that's okay, because Discount Comic Book Service doesn't mind late orders. So let's say we get to the tail end of June or the very beginning of July. That's okay. They'll take your June orders. They're just that nice of a retailer.
Yep, they'll be good to you.
Yes, right. So go to their website, dcbservice.com, for all of your comics pre-ordering needs. And after you do go there to get your comics, be sure to send them an email and tell them that the two guys with PhDs sent you.
Yes, do tell them.
So, Andy, yeah, we mentioned a second ago that we just got back into town, or at least you got back into town. I'm actually recording this from my father's house in Charlotte. You know, you and I were both at HeroesCon along with Andy Kunka. And so, yeah, I'm recording this on the road, so to speak. So I hope that the sound quality is the same as when I do this from the comforts of my own home, which I guess I can call my studio now. Mm-hmm. But you know, I'm looking forward to talking to you about these 3 books, because they're 3 very, very different titles, and they're interesting, to say the least, in their own way.
They are interesting, and these titles come from. I guess we could say that the creators of these three titles and or the subject matter is pretty much legendary. I mean, we've got two legendary creators that we're going to be talking with that we could basically say have helped to make comics history, and a title that is sort of an homage to a comics icon.
Mm-hmm, exactly. But let's go ahead and get started with that discussion.
Okay.
And the first book we're going to discuss is Gilbert Hernandez's Grip, The Strange World of Men. And this is being released through Dark Horse. And there's a little backstory here. You know, at the very top of the show, I said that this is sort of a new title from Gilbert Hernandez. It's actually not. The vast majority of Grip, the one that just recently came out from Dark Horse, was actually published previously from Vertigo. It came out in 5 single issues between January and May of 2002. So, it's been about 13 years since we first saw Grip, The Strange World of Men. Although in this new edition, Hernandez adds a few brand new pages. And those are all at the very beginning of this book, and we can talk about those in a second. But this is kind of an older work from Hernandez, appearing back in 2002. But he added new material, so I guess we're calling it sort of new.
And Derek, one of the things that's really unusual about this edition is that the comics, when they originally came out, were published in color.
Mm-hmm, that's right.
But this new Dark Horse edition is in black and white.
Yeah, now, I think I even asked you at HeroesCon what you thought of Grip, and, outside of you using the term whacked out, which I think is very appropriate for this, I was curious about how you found the art being in black and white, because I was used to this as a color comic, and I've even written about this before in some of my scholarship. So at first I had to get adjusted to the black and white aspect of this book, but that was easy enough to do, because almost everything that Hernandez comes out with, Gilbert Hernandez publishes, is in black and white.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's true. And I think it works, and I think I mentioned this to you at the con too, that it works well because you do have this sort of noirish element going on, and most of the great films noir were in black and white, and this really does lend itself pretty well to this story.
Yeah, and that's a great point to make. So I think by you using the term noir or noir comic, I think you've started to set up what this story is kind of about. And I use kind of, not lightly, because I'm not too sure I can put my finger on this. So for the uninitiated, how would you describe Grip, The Strange World of Men?
Oh boy, this is it's a real challenge to put this together. And Derek, I know how you hate these mashup descriptions, but the way I
kind of like mashup.
Do you like them? Okay,
yeah, I do.
I know we talk about it in the previews catalog how it says, well, this is a combination of this and this. And
specific titles. Yeah, sometimes it annoys me if it's too easy of a reference. But it's like, this is like Pretty Woman meets 2001: A Space Odyssey. It's like, what the hell is that?
Well, I you may hate this one too, but I keep thinking of it as a cross between Elmore Leonard and David Lynch. It's really, really strange, but it has so many of those noir elements, and especially those noir dialogue.
And I like that. I like that way
I like that
describing
too.
it.
And Elmore Leonard is such a master of those things. Okay, I'll try to give you listeners a rundown of the setup. This edition opens with some really bizarre scenes involving some strange, stretched faces, a mother, a baby, and a weird sort of prophecy. And Derek, I know these are technically some of the new pages, which I want to talk about later. And then the story actually starts as a disoriented young man wearing a suit and he has lipstick on his right cheek. This young man finds himself in a city, not knowing exactly who or where he is. And an old woman accosts him and says, "You ought to be ashamed of yourself, you awful man. How can they let criminals like you back on the street? What did your mother must think of you and your horrible ways?" And he just kind of shrugs this off, but he finds a wallet in his suit, and he sees a name and an address, and he decides to follow the address and return the wallet to a Mr. Gideon. And at the address, he finds Mrs. Gideon, as well as her grandson detective and another detective, who look out for Mrs. Gideon. And this young guy in the suit, whose name we later learn is Mike, also meets a stripper named Daisy and Casper, the bouncer who works at the strip club, both of whom appear to know Mike. And eventually Mike meets a guy named Joe Hook, a guy that seems to know everything about Mike, although Mike remembers very little. Now, if you're totally confused at this point, it's okay, because things get even more whacked out. This is probably the normal part of the book, and I think everything that happens beyond that just goes completely gonzo.
And yeah, I think you've done a great job of setting up the premise. And this was all originally in issue number 1 of Grip, the 5-issue series. But there was more to that first issue where we bring in more characters. So, for instance, you have 2 little people, one named Sammy Sanchez and his girlfriend Tigra. And Tigra may be a little person as well as Sammy, but she's someone who is, let's say, physically alluring, and all the men, regardless of how tall they are drawn to her. We also get in this first issue, or what is the first chapter of the new book from Dark Horse Grip, some women who come in, who we found out later are called the Mystery Girls, and they have a battle going on with a group of guys called the Overboys. And then there is this young girl with a patch over her eye named Echo, who seems a little strange, and we find out much more about her strangeness, that patch over her eye, as well as her link to all of this in the chapters that follow. So in this first chapter, which is originally, for the most part, the first issue of the 2002 series, Gilbert Hernandez throws a lot of stuff out there, and I think one of the biggest challenges of reading Grip, The Strange World of Men, is what you've been saying, Andy. It's really strange and confusing, and it does take a while to get your sea legs, so to speak, where you have to figure out, okay, who is related to who, and what connection does this character or this storyline have to this other character or storyline. And sometimes those events or connections do not become apparent until well into the novel. And, it could be the third or even the fourth, maybe even by the fifth, the final chapter. So if you're reading Grip, The Strange World of Men for the first time, especially if this is the first thing you've ever read from Gilbert Hernandez, my recommendation to you would be just stay with it. Just keep reading. It may not make sense at that moment or wherever you are in the text, but if you continue reading, it will make more sense. Now, maybe not perfect sense, maybe not be entirely clear, but it'll make more sense the more you read.
Derek, I think that, and I agree, that's probably the best way to approach this, is the first time through, just enjoy the ride, appreciate the weirdness of it. There's a lot of humor in here too. Again, this is Hernandez, and there's going to be a lot of great humor in there. And the second time through, you're going to make the connections, and you'll start to see things that he sprinkled in there, and more things will make sense. And I'm glad you mentioned that about Gilbert Hernandez and about possibly being a pretty good starting point for entering the world of Gilbert. If you haven't read a lot of Love and Rockets, and I haven't read a lot of it, I've read some of it. This is, I don't know, I think this might be a pretty good place to start, and I certainly have not read as much as you have, Derek or Andy, in the Love and Rockets universe. But there are elements of this that do help me, I think that would help an uninitiated reader to prepare for Love and Rockets.
Yeah, I think that's the case to a point. Now, when I said earlier that if this is your first introduction to Gilbert Hernandez, then just stick with it. Because I think if you know of Gilbert's other comics, then this should be familiar territory. Even the weirdness. Many times, I think you can define Gilbert's comics by this kind of strangeness that you've described as whacked out. But I can see where a first-time reader coming to Gilbert through Grip is going to wonder what's going on and why the hell did I get this book. I don't know if I would recommend this as the gateway drug, so to speak, to the Hernandez brothers or to Gilbert in particular, but I think it would be an interesting entry point. There are other works of Gilbert's, especially some of the later standalone graphic novels, depending on which one you're talking about, may or may not work very well as an introduction to Gilbert Hernandez's comics. This one, I think it could work well. I believed for a long time that the best way to become introduced to Gilbert Hernandez's work is through his Palomar stories, and maybe a great place to start, chronologically speaking, is the stories collected as Heartbreak Soup. And I think reading the Palomar stories from the beginning and then all the way through would give you a good sense of what Hernandez does. Now, by far, that's not the only kind of writing that he does, but I think it would prepare you for some of the other things that are a little more experimental and, in this case, almost surrealistic. Now, Grip comes at an interesting point in Gilbert Hernandez's career, and I think even though it's twisted, I do see a clear linear narrative from the beginning to the end. And at times that line becomes a little contorted and twisted at times. But it's not so experimental where you will be scratching your head and wondering if it actually is a story in the strictest sense. I mean, there is a story here. But it's definitely not the more realistic, or what some may even call the magical realist type of writing that defines his Palomar stories. Love and Rockets, the very first series, ended in 1996. And then the second series of the Love and Rockets comic, and for those who don't know, Love and Rockets is a creation of not only Gilbert, but also his brothers Jaime and then Mario. And usually it's Jaime and Gilbert, but Mario was there at the very beginning, and every now and again he'll touch in and contribute something to the Love and Rockets stories. But anyway, the second series began in 2001. Now, Grip came out at right about the time that the second series of Love and Rockets was starting to be published. Now, in the interim, between 1996 and 2001, both brothers were doing their own kind of comics. Sometimes they did something jointly, but more times than not, they did separate things. So, for instance, Jaime did the series Penny Century, and he did a limited series on wrestling called Whoa Nelly, and all of those are great. Gilbert, though, had his own individual series. He started off with a comic called Luba. And as you might imagine, it was based on probably his most iconic character, Luba, from the Palomar stories. And then there was Luba's Comics and Stories. And he also had another series in there for a while, in the interim between the first and second series of Love and Rockets, called New Love. And in Luba's Comics and Stories and New Love, he was continuing the Palomar stories to a large degree, but it was also trying some different things as well. And so the reason I'm mentioning this as a context is I think you can see in Grip a Gilbert Hernandez who wants to do the kind of things he had been doing primarily in his earlier Love and Rocket stories, which after a while became almost exclusively Palomar stories. And while at the same time, though, trying to branch out and do more experimental kind of comics that he had done early in his career. If you should go to the first several issues of Love and Rockets, that first series in the very early 1980s, there's some very whacked out, to use your phrase, stories from Gilbert Hernandez that would remind you of what you find in Grip. So I think that by the time that Gilbert and Jaime and even Mario get to this second series of Love and Rockets, that's when he is starting to create Gilbert Grip, The Strange World of Men. So I think it benefits from him having just recently come from that first series, playing around with these new titles like Luba's Comics and Stories and New Love, and just seeing where things went when he let his imagination run wild.
Yeah, and it certainly is running wild here, and in a great way. And you're definitely right, Derek. There is definitely a story here. It's not, you're not going to finish this book and say, well, this is just an incomprehensible mess. There is a story there, and you can follow it. He challenges you a little bit, and I appreciate that from Gilbert. The thing that I think is, even though it may not exactly it does not fit in within the Love and Rockets universe. For somebody that wants a taste of Gilbert's work that may be without necessarily getting involved in Love and Rockets, which can be a monumental task. Not monumental because it's not approachable, but just because there's so much of it. Grip might be a good starting point, just to give you just a taste of what his humor is like, definitely what his artwork is like, and many other elements.
Yeah, exactly. And I think one of those elements, and we may be remiss if we didn't mention this, is, how shall I put this? Gilbert's tendency to represent women in certain ways. I don't think that he denigrates or objectifies women, but let's just say that there are several women in Grip, The Strange World of Men, especially at the very end, and even at the beginning, and I don't want to give anything away here, whose proportions are very similar to those of Luba. And if you're listening to this podcast right now and you have no idea what I'm referring to, what I'm trying to say without coming right out and saying it, go do a search on Google, Gilbert, Hernandez, Luba, and you'll know what I'm talking about. Yeah, because I think that there are women like that. And in fact, a good bit of the punchline of this book, and I do think it's a punchline, it's a joke, and you mentioned Gilbert's humor. On the very last page of Grip, we find a visual that kind of underscores what I'm trying to say here indirectly. And I mention this because I've interviewed Gilbert a few times, and on a couple of occasions he has made reference to the fact that he's seen as someone who draws women with certain proportions, and he does that for a reason. I don't think it's gratuitous. Maybe some could see it that way, but I think that in Grip there is definitely a reason for why the women look the way that they do. In particular, Daisy. Now, you mentioned Daisy is a dancer at a strip club, and and we see her at the very end of this story, and that's the aforementioned punchline. This brings us back to those first, I think there are 4 brand new pages of Grip that Gilbert wrote for this new Dark Horse edition. I don't know, when I heard that there was going to be more story to Grip, I thought there would be more than just these first 4 pages that set up the story. And I think that those new pages are interesting, and they go a long way of helping set up that punchline even better than in the original 2002 version. So I appreciate that. But I don't know, I was expecting too much. I thought that there would be more than just those new pages at the very beginning, because what I did was, as I was reading Grip, the Dark Horse edition, I was also going through and flipping page by page through my original 5 issues of the Vertigo series, and except for the color, everything is there. There's really no change. The only addition in this new Dark Horse edition are those first 4 pages. So there's not much new material here, but I think it's important new material.
Yeah, and those 4 pages serve as a nice prologue, and as you said, they are helpful. I don't know that they're completely necessary because, again, as you mentioned, the first publication did not include those, but it does clear up a couple of things, and it does really set up the payoff at the end in a really nice way.
Mm-hmm, exactly. Do you think that this book would be a turnoff to readers, especially if they're not familiar with the kind of comics that Gilbert produces?
Well, that's a great question, and as you mentioned, you've interviewed Gilbert a few times, and I actually listened to the last interview you and Kanka did, and I don't really remember if this was a response to people complaining about the way he depicts women, but I remember him saying something to the effect of, "Look, I'm just having a good time with this story. It's just fun. I'm just having a good time." Does the way that he depicts women and the nudity serve the story? Yeah, I think it does. I think there's a reason for it. I don't, like you said, it's not gratuitous. It's not there just for the sake of being there. There's a reason that he's doing it. I think part of that is, like he said, is, he's just having fun with the story, but I think it serves a bigger purpose too.
Yeah, exactly. And he also said in our last interview that Kunk and I did that, he's not really a safe cartoonist. And so if you're looking for that, you may want to look elsewhere. And that's fine. You mentioned the sex or the nudity. I really don't think that there's much of any nudity in this.
No, in fact, I was really surprised because I thought, having looked at some of his, like you said, some of the Luba stories, that there's really nothing gratuitous. I mean, there's a lot of strategically placed, objects, hands, or whatever, and there's nothing on this Dark Horse, the back of it, that says anything about the audience, at least that I can see. It doesn't say for mature audiences or anything like that. So, I kind of thought it was quite subdued. Yeah,
and also keep it, well, it's violent in places, but not even the violence that we've come to almost expect from Gilbert from his later work, but even in the earlier Palomar stories as well, there was quite a bit of violence. And I think part of the reason why there may be a little subdued, like no nudity and subdued violence, is this originally appeared as a Vertigo title. And
right.
Even though in Vertigo books you can do more than you can in the regular DC books, you still can't go that far. You can't go too far as Gilbert tends to go with some of his, let's say, Fantagraphics works, especially the original graphic novels. I don't know if there's anything here that would be a turn off to readers except for maybe the confusing storyline.
Right.
Yeah. But I definitely think it's worth it.
Yeah, it's definitely worth it if you want to know what, or at least, again, I think it's a good introduction to Gilbert's work. Maybe not a completely representative entry into his work, but I think it's a good start.
Yeah, and another important thing about this is the first time that Grip, The Strange World of Men, has been collected, and I think that's important. Yeah, and it's also notable because, Andy, not too long ago, you and I had discussed Sweatshop from Peter Bagge, and that also had appeared as a Vertigo title, or actually I think a DC title, not Vertigo, it was a DC title originally, but it had not yet been collected, and then finally Fantagraphics came out with the collection. So this is yet another instance of something that originally came out as a serial from DC or Vertigo, but it took another publisher, once the creators got the rights to reproduce everything as in a collection, it took another publisher to actually get these things collected. And so, I'm glad that Grip is finally in one edition, and just as I was glad several months ago that Peter Bagge's Sweatshop finally came out as one book.
Yeah, so kudos to Dark Horse for making this available, not only available, but available in a really nice hardcover edition for not an awful lot of money.
And one other thing before we go. Now, let me ask you, Andy, are you familiar with Gilbert's character from the Palomar stories, Venus?
No, I haven't read many of those, so the name doesn't ring a bell.
Okay, she's a young girl, blonde hair, kind of long, and in reading Grip this time around, I couldn't help but wonder if maybe Venus was an idea that led to Echo, or if Echo led to Venus, I'm not sure. Or if in other words, I'm wondering if the genesis of the Venus and Echo characters had similar ground. Now, Echo has an eye patch, and there's something really funky about her eye patch. I don't want to give anything away, but her eye patch becomes important. Let's just say that as the story progresses. But I've looked at some of the composition of some panels in Grip and the way that Echo is drawn, and I've gone back also to look at some of the Venus stories that are actually collected, and the Adventures of Venus from a few years ago from Fantagraphics. And the composition and the way that these characters look, strikingly similar, I think.
Do you know when Venus first appeared?
Venus first appeared in that interim period between the first Love and Rockets series ending in 96 and the second one beginning in 2001. So Venus would have come before Echo, but I'm wondering, because of the similarities visually, if maybe Gilbert had in mind a certain character type. A young girl, somewhat innocent, but at the same time has certain abilities or powers in the case of Echo, blonde hair. And I may be completely off here. I'm just kind of speculating and curious that if you knew about Venus, what you thought of that.
Yeah, I don't know because I haven't read enough of those, but that might be a great question to ask him the next time you have him on the show.
Yeah, and I hope we will have him on the show at some point in the near future. So, Andy, you want to move on to our next title for this week?
Sure.
And that is Eric Shanower and Gabriel Rodriguez's Little Nemo, Return to Slumberland. What were your thoughts of this book?
I initially had some... I'll go ahead and admit it. I had some initially negative thoughts because I've known of the original Little Nemo for years, and I just bought one of those collections a few months ago and just loved it. And I thought, this is something sacred that they're messing with here. But I'll tell you my opinion in just a moment. But I wanted to tell listeners, for those who may not be familiar with Little Nemo was a weekly newspaper comic strip called Little Nemo in Slumberland, written and drawn by Winsor McCay. And Little Nemo first ran in the New York Herald from 1905, that's right, 1905 to 1911, and then in the New York American from 1911 to 1914. So this is a strip and a character in a comic that's well over 100 years old. Each of these one-page stories began with a little boy named Nemo at home in his bed, about to go to sleep, summoned to some fantastic adventure from which he would awaken at the end, in the last panel, at home in bed. And although that sounds rather routine, what happens between those first and last panels is absolute magic. And McCay gives us some of the most colorful, creative, imaginative, strange, surreal, and bizarre artwork, really in all of comics history, if not all of art history.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so now your initial, at least potential, objection to the new Nemo comic, Little Nemo, Return to Slumberland, is that you thought that it would, tarnish or play off of, in kind of a cheap way, the original classic?
Yeah, and Derek, it just reminds me of things like, when somebody tries to do something like remake The Wizard of Oz, or, something that's just iconic, and everyone may not be familiar with Little Nemo, but most comics readers of a certain age know what Little Nemo is. So to tamper with that, or to quote unquote update that for the modern audience, that usually spells trouble for me.
Yeah, and this is definitely not, let's say, a cinematic remake of, let's say, this Beverly Hillbillies. Now I don't want to say that I'm putting the Beverly Hillbillies television show in the same league as McCay's Little Nemo. Not that at all. So please, comics readers, do not send emails of hate to me. But I can see where you're coming from, thinking that maybe this is kind of a new edition or a new version or a rebooting of Little Nemo, but it's not at all. And in fact, I think that's one of the beauties of this series' premise.
I think so too, and I was pleasantly surprised by what I read, because this new title, it does, the surroundings of this new title recall some of the original, but yet it has, I think, successfully created its own take on Little Nemo.
Because it doesn't attempt to redo Little Nemo. What it does is it uses the reality or the presence of Little Nemo as a springboard into a completely different kind of series. And I think the setup to this that we find in the first chapter, which was the very first issue of this trade, and in fact, Little Nemo Return to Slumberland from IDW, it contains the first 4 issues of this series. So issues 1 through 4 are collected here in a beautiful new edition. But so in this first chapter, how do Shanower and Rodriguez set this up?
Well, they set it up again in the original story. You have to remember this came out as a large newspaper comic, and it took up an entire page. Mm-hmm. And what happened was all pretty much self-contained within that one page. I mean, the adventures would continue week to week, but this came out weekly. So you would you read a story, and then you would wait another week for another little Nemo story to come around. Well, obviously they're not going to do that here because we're not dealing with a newspaper. We're dealing with a comic book, and then now we have a collected edition. So the difference is the stories, each issue is a much longer story and has really more of a plot than each of the initial Little Nemo from basically the turn of the century had. And one of the geniuses, I think, in what the creators have done, what Shanower and Rodriguez have done, they have now understood that the audience for this comic in 2015 is a very different audience, and not only a different audience, but a different format. And the way that they've translated that initial newspaper comic to a comic in 2015, they've really done an exceptional job, because we have the original intent of those stories, but they're created in a way that a modern reader can understand and appreciate and love them.
Yeah, exactly. And in this first issue especially, and we get this, or the first chapter, I guess, this being the book, but we also get this a little bit in the second chapter. The story is set up very similar to the original newspaper series in that Nemo's asleep, and then someone from Slumberland attempts to make contact with him. Things go a little weird, and something happens to where Nemo wakes up, usually by falling out of bed, and he wonders in the last panel, wow, that was some weird dream. Mm-hmm. And especially in this first chapter, we get a series of these short bits within the first chapter. And at first, well, basically the premise is that in Slumberland you have King Morpheus, who, King of Slumberland, who says that his princess, the princess of Slumberland, his daughter, would like a playmate. And playmates that she has had since the original Nemo just really haven't worked out. And so he has his court, King Morpheus has his court, desperately looking for the perfect playmate that won't disappoint his daughter. And they find someone. And in fact, they find someone whose name is Nemo. And so the princess says, that's him. That's got to be the guy. It's the same name. Please bring him here so he can be my playmate. Now, the problem with this is that the young kid, in, I guess, present day, for all practical purposes, at least it seems to me, because we really don't see him much outside of Slumberland or his dreams. But the new kid, his middle name is Nemo. His first name is James, but he's called Jimmy. But he tells the people who come to get him for the princess, first Popcorn, a character named Popcorn, and then Bon Bon, the candy kid, that, he was called Nemo because his parents liked the original, McKay comic from back in the day. So they named him Nemo as a middle name. But everyone from Slumberland keeps calling him Nemo, and at first that really pisses him off. That, upsets Jimmy. So, but in this first chapter, first Popcorn and then Bon Bon come to him in his dreams and say, let's go see the Princess of Slumberland. And in their early attempts to get there, something always happens, which ends up with Jimmy/Nemo waking up and wondering, wow, what just happened? That must have been a weird dream.
Yeah. And that was the way the newspaper comic would always be.
Exactly, exactly.
You'd have you have these weird adventures, and then in the last panel, usually he was awake in his bed, and his mom or his dad or his grandfather said, I told you not to eat chocolate cake before you went to bed, or, something like that. That was always kind of funny. But again, the format of this makes that, he doesn't really, he pretty much spends the entire issue in Slumberland.
Yeah, he does. But now, by the time we get to Chapter 2, which was originally issue 2 of the series, Nemo, through the help of Bon Bon, the candy kid, they finally make their way to Slumberland. And so, Nemo, or Jimmy, I guess, because he doesn't like the name Nemo, even though after a while he comes to accept it, right? Because at first he resists Slumberland. He says he'll only meet the princess, but if he doesn't like it and doesn't like her, then, he wants to be taken home. But he eventually, through, various events and whatnot, comes to have Slumberland people grow on him. And I think by the end of this first collection, again, which collects the first 4 issues of the series, we have Jimmy/Nemo more or less accepting the fact that he's wanted at Slumberland, and even accepts the name Nemo.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, he has come to accept it, and we won't get into too much of the plot details, but there is a change that happens, and he has a change of heart. And one of the things that makes him have this change of heart, I mean, he initially gets there and he thinks, oh, princess, yucky, I don't want to spend time, having tea and playing with dolls and that type of thing. But while he's there, and I'm just going to go ahead and call him Nemo for the rest of the time we talk about it.
Sure.
Instead of Jimmy, it's just a little easier to keep up with. Anyway, Nemo meets this kid named Flip Flap, or we can just call him Flip, and he's the nephew of the Dawn Guard. And he meets Nemo, and he actually wants to. He basically just wants to have fun. And he's a really odd-looking character. He's kind of a cross between Edward G. Robinson and a carnival sideshow character. And actually, he's munching on a cigar, and you can almost hear him go, nah, nah, like Edward G. Robinson.
Hey, you do that really well.
Oh, thanks. And he just wants to kind of have fun in Slumberland, and he's kind of a mischievous guy. And Flip gets him into some adventures, and one of the greatest adventures is Flip takes Nemo to this tower called the Tessellated Tower, and it's this enormous tower that MC Escher would be proud of. There's so many weird things going on, but Flip and Nemo get to develop a kind of a relationship. And there's one great scene where Flip and Nemo are shrunken down to very, very small, and the Bonbon, the Candy Kid, said that there's a way to restore them, and there's this pill that they can eat. And Bonbon says, well, Flip's so much easier to control at this size. And the princess says, true. Yet while we have the power to restore him, we've no right to withhold it. So there's this element, too, that runs throughout the series, that there is a certain order in Slumberland. And not only is everything beautiful and gorgeous, but there's also a sense of goodness in it. And you don't really feel that Flip is kind of, the serpent in the Garden of Eden. I don't think he's that bad. But he does introduce kind of a mischievous element into it.
Right, exactly. And you said a couple of things there that I really want to go with here. First off, Flip. Flip is a character from the original comic as well. He was this cigar chewing, almost clown type figure, and it was his job to, I guess, wake up Nemo while he was asleep, because he would have in his hat, and we even see this in the new Little Nemo Return to Slumberland, at least when we first see Flip, he has a little sign in the brim of his hat that says, wake up. And in fact, when Nemo/Jimmy sees Flip for the first time, he says, why is there a sign in your hat? And he says, read it, wake up. That's what you're supposed to do. And, just as in the original McKay Little Nemo, here in this new version that IDW is coming out with, Flip is this mischievous being, kind of funny, a clown-like character, and I like your description of him as a mix between Edward Gene Robinson and a sideshow character. Who, it tries to disturb things. In other words, if the princess wants things set just right, which that's the kind of person she is, Flip is the nemesis. Flip is the character that wants to turn over on its head anything that the princess wants. But you're right that he does get to. There's something kind of likable about him in the same way, again, as in the original, and he becomes a companion of Nemo. Now, the other thing you mentioned that I want to really go with here is when they are in the tessellated tower, because this occurs in Chapter 3 of the book. I don't know about you, Andy, but this is my favorite part of Little Nemo Return to Slumberland.
Yeah, me too.
And this is something, and in many ways it reminds me not on the same level as Alan Moore's Watchmen. And of course, we're going to be talking about Alan Moore in a moment, but there's something similar going on in terms of a kind of a symmetry between pages. In that when Nemo and Flip are in the tessellated towers, you mentioned Escher. When they first get there, it does have an Escher-like feel to it, and things do become very topsy-turvy. And so there are a series of pages in this third chapter where they're having one adventure, and then you turn the page, and even though they're having another adventure, so temporally things have changed. They've moved on. It's kind of a linear movement. We see a repeat of the previous page, but inverted. Mm-hmm. And so where things had been upside down, now they're right side up. Where things have been on the left, now they're on the right. And what both Shanower and Rodriguez do is they give us several pages of this kind of flipped, somewhat symmetrical adventure that Flip and Nemo have in the tessellated tower, and it just makes it fun. But it allows them to do some really amazing things as well, because depending on whether these creatures are upright in one direction or upright in another, they could be, for instance, gremlins within the tessellated tower who are out to get Nemo and Flip. Or if they're upside down, or right side up, I guess, it's all relative, then they're fairies who were there to help Nemo and Flip. So depending on how these panels are turned, you have either people trying to help them or to, attack them. So I just thought that was clever. It was a fun read. And this leads me to another question for you, Andy. Now, you and I were briefly discussing this at one point at HeroesCon. After dinner one night. You do a lot of work with young adult readers, with kids readers in the library. How do you think this book would resonate with young readers on your library shelf?
That's a good question. As far as I know, we don't have this in our collection yet, but I'm going to make sure that we do have it. This, I think, would be a really great title for young readers, even older readers as well. I think the things that are going to draw them in, first of all, obviously, are going to be the wonderful colors. And the colors are done here by Nelson Daniel. Just wonderful work here. But just, and I always tell people that I work with and people that I know enjoy books that, it's rare to find a book, whether it's a novel or a graphic novel, that has a sense of wonder. And this book certainly has that sense of wonder. And children seem to see that more than we do. I think they still have something that a lot of adults lose when they get older, and that is part of that is that sense of wonder. And they can just look at a book and just be absorbed in it. And I think Little Nemo, Return to Slumberland, could have a big part of getting a child's attention or developing that sense of wonder and expanding that sense of wonder. I think this is something that children would have to be led to. I'm not sure it's something that they're going to pick up on their own, and most of that is because they're looking for the Iron Man books and the Captain America books, which is fine. But this is something different that they should be geared. They should be led to willingly and hopefully not reluctantly.
Yeah, and if their parents are familiar with Little Nemo historically, Winsor McCay, his kind of comics, and even if they haven't read the original, they may have a sense of who Little Nemo was. And so I think that those are the parents and guardians who should introduce the kids to this, because I think that if the younger reader looks at the cover of this book, they're instantly going to be intrigued. And that leads me to, you were talking about the color as being a big draw, and that's definitely the case. But I think what really does it for me in Little Nemo Return to Slumberland is Gabriel Rodriguez's art. I enjoyed his art in Lock and Key, where he worked on with Joe Hill.
Right.
But there's something, and it's interesting because Little Nemo is a very, very different tone, has a different tone from Lock and Key. But that just, I think, is a testament to Rodriguez's art, that he can write something for a series like Lock and Key and then writes something for a completely different kind of comic, Little Nemo, Return to Slumberland. And the art in this book, I think, is very kid-friendly. I don't want to suggest that it's cartoony and minimal in that way. It's very detailed. It's very intricate, and I think that's one of the big draws for me as an adult reader. But it's the kind of art that I think a kid would really take to. All the creatures, including Flip, who is a bit of a freak, is presented in kind of a friendly, approachable way, visually speaking. So I think that the art goes a long way to bring young readers into this book. And the reason I asked you about the young reader potential for this within the context of Chapter 3, because I would think that as a young reader, that time in the Tessellated Tower has to be the funnest moment in this book.
Yeah, it's an incredible scene, and I might say too that maybe that's the highlight of the book for me. But all of it is just wonderful. And Derek, I'm glad you talked about Rodriguez, because when I first learned that he was going to be the artist on this, I've also read all of Lock and Key, and I really enjoyed it. But when I first learned that he was going to be the artist, I thought, is he really the best artist for this book? But I have to take all of that away, because Rodriguez just blew me away with this. And I do want to talk a little bit about one of the things that makes this so impressive. Rodriguez has a way of depicting and rendering the vastness, and it's a very vast place, the vastness of Slumberland without sacrificing detail. And even more impressive, he has a way of subduing those incredible images, almost muting them when they appear in the background, so that the characters remain the focus of each panel. And I think one of the ways he does this is in making the line work of the backgrounds a few shades lighter than the black lines of the characters, which makes the characters more distinct and more clear. And again, Nelson Daniel does a great job of doing the same thing with the colors. While they're still bold and wildly imaginative, the background colors are slightly muted so that the colors of the characters become our primary focus. And if you go back and look at what Winsor McCay did, he did the very same thing. And if you look at that original art, not the original art, but what we have, he does the very same thing. Everything that's in the background is a little bit muted as far as the black outlines and the colors, and everything that he has up front is more vivid. So my hat's off to Rodriguez and Daniel for doing an exceptional job of making this happen on the page.
Oh, exactly. Now, we've been talking a lot about the art, but I want to talk a few moments about the writing. Eric Shanower. Now, I know that some may know him from Age of Bronze, but I know Shanower primarily through his adaptations, yes, plural, of The Wizard of Oz. He's done adaptations of The Wizard of Oz for Marvel not too long ago, just a few years ago, but he's also done his own adaptations outside of Marvel of the Wizard of Oz story world. And I think he was the perfect writer for this, given his background with L. Frank Baum's work, perfect for Winsor McCay in this fantastical world of Slumberland. So I think that the story is really spot on. And one of the things that Shanower does that I appreciated, that I think could be a potential turnoff to some readers, is that he tells the story and he has the characters interact in a way that I guess is kind of a dated way of character interaction in comics. So, for instance, in the 1940s and 50s, it wasn't unusual for in comic strips as well, it wasn't unusual for a character to be falling down some stairs and going, "Oh my God, I'm falling downstairs." It's like, okay, well, duh, we see you falling downstairs. Why do you have to say it? Right. Or as someone's trying to sneak up on someone, going around a corner, I am going to sneak up on him as I turn this corner. And that was common. Now we rarely see dialogue of that sort in comics. But this is what you find in Little Nemo Return to Slumberland, where a character like Nemo or Bon, they're falling down. "Oh, help me, I'm falling. What's going on? I can't see. I must be in the dark." And I think that, some may see that as like, okay, that's kind of antiquated storytelling. Not at all. What Shanower is doing is he's paying homage to the kind of storytelling, the kind of writing that we see from McCay and others in the early part of the 20th century that we don't see in comics anymore.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and you know, as you mentioned, these guys clearly have a huge amount of respect for what Winsor McCay has done, and that's just another example of how they have integrated some of that into a more modern day comic, and it really works. You know, there's so many when you look at something like this, there's so many ways in which it could have gone wrong, but these guys have really done a great job of taking the original intent of the comic strip and making it work in modern day.
You know, one other thing before we leave Little Nemo Return to Slumberland is we've noted a number of characters that appear in this new book that appeared in the original McCay Little Nemo. You know, of course, Nemo, then there's King Morpheus, and, you know, the Princess of Slumberland, there's Flip. But there's and there's the Candy Kid, but there's also a character in the original comic that I think understandably does not appear in the new IDW series, and that is the African Imp.
Yes.
For those who aren't familiar with the original Little Nemo, the imp, the little imp, or the African imp, is kind of a stereotypically drawn black African who looks who's small like Nemo, but you know, who is in, I guess you could say, stereotypical African garb, but also in terms of the racism that was just embedded in the culture at the times. And I'm not suggesting that Winsor McCay was a racist, I don't know, but the way that the little imp was drawn was not dissimilar to the way that other black characters were drawn at the time, you know, with the lips and the big eyes. So, and I just wanted to point that out to say that I don't think that Shanower and Rodriguez are going to be including the African imp in the new Little Nemo anytime soon.
I seriously doubt it, and I think that's a good move.
Yeah, and if they do, I think they'll have to completely redo that kind of character. And maybe having some other characters in this book to take the place of that, and maybe this is where a character we haven't even mentioned yet, Frunkus. Who's this weird little creature, almost like a dog, comes into play. You know, they're going to have other characters that they can create that could, I guess, for all practical purposes, take the place of characters like the African Imp from the original.
Yeah, and another thing, Derek, that I like about this new version of it's really it could be as timeless as the original was, in that we don't see Nemo, in bed doing things like talking on the cell phone or playing his Xbox. None of that stuff is there, because this is something that hopefully kids will want to, and I hope this is going to be a long running series. I really, really do, but it doesn't have anything that ties it to any certain time. It could be taking place anywhere. In fact, I don't remember there being any references to anything modern day. Do you? I don't think there were.
No. Now, I mentioned earlier that I just assumed that this was a contemporary world, but I'm glad you made that observation, that there are no visual or even textual links in there to anchor this in a particular time. You're right. He's not playing on his little handheld device. He doesn't have a cell phone that he's talking to someone, texting someone with, and I think that's great. So I think if they continue, if Showalter, Shanower, and Rodriguez continue to create Little Nemo Return to Slumberland in this manner, then this could be a timeless book. Maybe not on the level of the original McCay, but definitely something that, regardless of where people are, temporally speaking, could appreciate that story.
Mm-hmm. And this is currently nominated for an Eisner.
Yep. And I think it should win.
I hope it does. There's some really great things in that category. So it'll be a tough one. But this is a really good book.
Yeah, I was introduced to this with the first issue, and it won me over immediately. So that's one of the reasons why I'm really pulling for this.
Yeah.
So let's get to the third title that we're discussing this week, and this is Alan Moore and Jacen Burrows, issue number 1 of Providence. So this is coming out from Avatar Press, and of course Avatar does a lot of Alan Moore stuff. And this is Alan Moore returning to the world of Lovecraft that he seems to really enjoy and appreciate. And in fact, Providence, I've heard referred to as the Watchman of Horror, or this will be the Watchman of Horror. Mm. So, I mean, that's a lot to measure up to. So, I mean, there's a part of me that wonders, why would you do something like this? Because, I mean, I really like this first issue, and if things continue as they are, then there's that potential. But if things start to flag after issue, let's say 2 or 3, then they've set themselves up, I guess. And yeah. I can't remember where I heard, I don't know if it was in the solicit. I think it was in the preview solicit a couple of months ago that this was called, or that this will be the Watchmen of the horror genre. So they may have set themselves up for a little too much there, but I guess we'll see this play out, because this is appearing in 8 issues?
Is it going to be 8
or is it 10? I can't remember.
I read it, but I can't remember either.
Yeah, but it's definitely a limited series. Yeah. And how would you set up the first issue of Providence?
Well, actually, before I set it up, I should probably tell listeners that I have one of my goals for this year, or call it resolutions if you want, but I think goals is a better word, was to read more Alan Moore in 2015. And I really haven't done much of that, because one of my other goals was to read more Love and Rockets. And those are two pretty lofty goals, because there's so much from each of those creators. So one of the reasons I wanted to do this was so I could kind of get jump-started on reading more Alan Moore. And, Derek, I have not read any of the other Lovecraft-related books from Alan Moore, so this is kind of a starting point for me, and I was hoping that it would be a good starting point for other listeners who maybe have not read any of the more recent Alan Moore books. And this one with Jacen, is it Jacen Burrows?
Yes.
He's worked with Moore many times previously, and he comes back to work with him again.
Yeah, so, in fact, he worked with him on another Lovecraft-influenced book that came out in 2010, and that also from Avatar, Neonomicon. That was a 4-issue limited series as well. So, I don't know if you read that one. Did you?
I haven't read it, but it came to the library, and I do want to read it. It's on my list of more Alan Moore books to read.
Okay, now when you say it came to your library, you didn't put it in the kids section, I hope.
No.
Okay, I was about to say.
No.
Now, I didn't read the one that came before that, The Courtyard, but I did read Neonomicon, and when it first came out, I thought it was okay. I guess I need to go back and reread it in light of Providence now, because I remember my first time reading this, I thought, I definitely enjoyed Burrows' art, and when I was reading it, I kept thinking I should enjoy Alan Moore's writing, but Neonomicon didn't hit me in the same way that other things that Moore has done seems to always hit me. But maybe going back and rereading, I can appreciate it in a better way. But let's talk about Providence #1.
Yeah, let's do. Actually, the book starts with a subtitle, and it has the Roman numeral 1, the yellow sign. And the comic begins, and we read a letter. In fact, this comic begins and ends with a letter, or a journal entry. But we begin with a letter dated April 12th, 1919, and it starts, "Dear Jonathan, well, what a night." And the writer of this letter goes on to describe what appears to be a romantic tryst. And we see the back of a man as he reads the letter and begins to tear the letter down the middle and then tear it up into little pieces, and they drift into the water as he overlooks a city, which we assume is New York City, from a balcony. The next scene we see is a newspaper office. And there's a whole group of people in there, Mr. Posey, who I assume is the editor, some other characters, and the main protagonist of our story, Bobby Black. and they're all trying to come up with a newspaper story to fill half of a newspaper page that's about to be printed. Black gets the idea to interview a man named Dr. Alvarez. He's a local doctor who wrote an essay on a book, and the book was called Sous le Monde, I believe is correct. Sous le Monde. Oh, I just typed it wrong. A book that apparently, as one of the characters says, sent everybody crazy. Well, as we're getting some of this information, we also see a little bit of Bobby's backstory, and we learn that he's a young man from Wisconsin who wants to be a journalist in New York, and that's something his parents really don't understand. And as we see Bobby's backstory progressing, we also learn a little bit about some of Bobby's former relationships. So, getting back to the main story, Bobby meets this Dr. Alvarez, and Dr. Alvarez is a kind of a reclusive doctor who lives in this apartment where he has to have everything cold all the time. That's actually a reminder of a Lovecraft story that I'll bring up in a moment, Derek, or you can bring it up. He has some really strange. The Dr. Alvarez starts to tell Bobby some really strange things. One of the things that he says is, there is a concealed country hidden below the society we show the world. This truth, it is a land sunken beneath many fathoms. Were it one day to rise and confront us all, what would you do, Mr. Black? What would any of us do? So as Bobby's trying to get this story out of this Dr. Alvarez, he has kind of a strange, unsettling feeling. And, you could, Derek, say in a way that nothing really happens in this first issue, but what Moore and the artist Burrows do, they're really setting the groundwork. And, you even though you don't get a lot of what we might come to think of as weirdness from this issue, we get this just real huge sense of foreboding, like something is really, really going to happen that's pretty wild. It just gives you a sense of unease throughout the whole story, and I don't want to get too much further into the plot, but again, this all feels like it's a really big introduction to something else.
Yeah. Now, it's interesting. I want to comment on a couple of things you said. You said that nothing much seems to happen, and I want to underscore the word seems. And then you also mentioned that there wasn't much strangeness or weirdness, maybe that was the word you used, that goes on in terms of the horrific or the unusual or supernatural.
Yeah. I probably should have said visual weirdness.
Yeah. Yeah, okay. Well, yeah, that would have qualified it. Actually, I think that there's a lot that goes on in this first issue. I don't think it's as apparent as an initial reading would suggest. And I also think that this is quite a creepy first issue. And maybe I was primed for the creepiness given the reference that comes up again and again. And in fact, it's embedded in the very title of this issue. And that is, references to Robert Chambers's The King in Yellow. Mm-hmm. And this is a text that has quite a long backstory. And in fact, it's by far not the only time that the King in Yellow has been mentioned in a comic. And I'm not only talking about in Alan Moore with his fascination for Lovecraft, but in fact, late this month, Ian Gilbert is going to be doing an adaptation of Chambers's The King in Yellow. And in fact, I'm hoping that we can get Gilbert on the podcast for an interview. He said he would love to do this earlier in the year. Good. But they postponed the publication of this book, and this is coming out from, I believe it's Self-Made Hero. So that's something I'm looking forward to I'm looking forward to reading this and also looking forward to talking with Gilbert for the show. But to get back to Providence issue number 1, I mean, there are all of these references to Chambers' King in Yellow, which has a similar history as this fictional text, Sous le Monde, which is French for under the world, if you want to translate it literally. So that passage that you read where Alvarez is talking to Black, I think is key, right? He says that there are things that go on below the surface that we just don't acknowledge to ourselves and definitely to other people, but it's there. You know, there are secrets about me, for instance, his relationship with Miss Ortega, and of course, I get the sense that there's much darker things going on with Alvarez. For instance, that disease that he has, and the room that he's in that is cooled by the new, at the time, a cooling system based on ammonia. So there's something different going on with him. But he even says to Black, and I'm sure that you have your secrets as well. Now, there are references, I think, kind of slant references to Robert Black's secrets that we get in this first issue. And that leads me to, the other thing that I had mentioned, that not much happens. You're right. It seems like not much happens, but actually this is a very active first issue, because we get not just one story, which is basically the story that you revealed as the setup. It seems to me that there are 3 narratives that are being told here. The apparent one is the story of Robert Black in the current narrative that he's a part of, right, that you just described, where he's looking for a news story. He goes to Alvarez. He talks with Alvarez. He comes back to the newsroom. So that's basically all that happens in this first issue. But there are other stories being told as well. Now, you mentioned that this first issue opens with a letter, that someone wrote someone a letter. And we see a man in black. He's wearing a black suit, and he's not the only character, not the only man wearing a black suit in this story, but he is distinguished by his white spats. And in fact, I wonder, why don't people wear spats anymore?
I don't know.
That's another topic for a different podcast, I think. But this character is wearing the white spats that really stand out. So we see this man, and that's on the first page of Providence #1. Then we get to the story with Robert Black and, Mr. Posey, Dix, and Prissy. Trying to find this story, he goes to see Alvarez. But every now and again, interspersed within Robert Black's story of him going to see Alvarez and then coming back to the newsroom, we find the little bits, maybe a page each time, of this man in black and what he's going through and what happens. Now, we get a little more information on what this man in black with the spats may be about at the very end of this issue, and that's in the journal entry that I think concludes this first issue. And I don't want to give anything away here, but that's the second story that's being told. And then a third story that's being told also takes place as Robert Black is on his way to see Alvarez, because as he's walking the streets and going to the apartment, down, I think it's on 14th Street, this is definitely downtown, where things can be a little seamier. We get flashbacks of Robert's life, growing up in, what was it Milwaukee?
Yeah, I think it's Milwaukee, Wisconsin.
Growing up in Milwaukee, leaving home, and what he was like coming to New York for the first time, and then meeting someone by the name of Lillian Russell. Okay, so we get these flashbacks, and these flashbacks are presented visually in a more sepia-type tone. So that distinguishes the current color world of Robert Black from the flashbacks, which are in this sepia brownish tone. So we have those 3 storylines. We've got the current story of Robert Black getting the story, and the current story of this man in black going somewhere and doing something, we don't know what. And then there's the third story of the flashback of Robert's life before he got to New York, and then right when he got to New York, and in his relationship with Lily Russell.
And Derek, I would almost argue that we have a fourth story too, and that is the story of Dr. Alvarez himself, because there's clearly something going on that we have not been told about, although it has been hinted. And if you've read some Lovecraft, there is a story called Cool Air that may explain some of what Dr. Alvarez is going through. If you haven't read that story, though, I would say do not read it, because we aren't really sure where Alan Moore is going to take us with this, but it did remind me of that story. Are you familiar with that story, Derek?
No, I'm not.
Yeah, I would say don't read it right now, but it did bring it to mind to me, because it's a story that I've read a few times. So there's another Lovecraft connection there. So I actually would say there's a fourth story involving Dr. Alvarez.
Yeah, now I agree with you that Alvarez is an intriguing character and there's more going on with him than we see. I wouldn't say that he is a fourth storyline in this issue because basically the only time we see him is through the eyes of Robert and his story, the main storyline. Now, if we had gotten parts of Alvarez, part of his backstory or something about who he is that was outside of the awareness of the main character, Robert, then yeah, I would say that would make it a fourth story. And maybe we will have a different story of Dr. Alvarez. I don't know, but I don't know. He's an intriguing character with a lot of potential, and there definitely is that under the world aspect to him, right? Something below the surface that we don't see. There's that potential, but I don't see that played out in this first issue, which makes me even more interested in what will happen in the second issue.
Well, but Derek, that final shot is from his point of view.
Okay. Let me look at this again. So the final shot of the comic?
Yeah, the comic proper before we get into the journal entry.
Let me look, because that journal entry is, I think, 3 pages long?
Yeah, I think it's 3 pages long.
You're not talking about the commonplace. Okay, you're right. I forgot about Miss Ortega, who comes
because the first time I read through that, I thought that was from Bobby's point of view, and then I took a closer look and I see his beard. So that is from his point of view.
Okay. Now I think that this is a potential fourth story. So I'm glad I completely overlooked this, but you're right. Because this is outside of Robert Black's awareness. Yeah. Okay. So there are 4 stories going on.
That's my
here.
case for the fourth story.
Well, okay, you made your case and won me over.
Okay. One of the things, though, Derek, that I really do like and I agree. I would not agree with those who say there's nothing going on because, as you said, there is a lot going on here. But if you're looking for like a lot of fireworks or that type of thing, you're not going to find the visual fireworks. I do think there are other types of fireworks going on, and there's so much. As Dr. Alvarez said, there's so much below the surface here, and again, the title of the book alludes to that. And the really great thing I love with what Alan Moore is doing here is we have a journalist. Here's somebody that for their profession, their job is to seek the truth. That's what they're doing. They're trying to uncover things that are being covered up or unknown. And it seems that one of the things that Dr. Alvarez is saying is, you're seeking the truth. Do you really, really want to find the truth? And I think going to be one of the main themes of this book. There's some other things that are very, very significant, I think. In one of the scenes, Bobby meets one of his friends named Charles. And he confesses to Charles that he wants to write something, quote, something big, something that cuts to the heart of this country and these times, that talks about things nobody's dared to talk about before. So Bobby is clearly a character that is pursuing things, and he wants to get to the truth. He wants to uncover things. He has this drive. In another scene where Bobby meets Mrs. Ortega, and she understands that he's a journalist that wants to talk to Dr. Alvarez. She pleads with Bobby not to print lies in his newspaper, and he assures her, us reporters pride ourselves on accuracy. The day I'm knowingly dishonest with a feature is the day I quit journalism. Mm-hmm. And I like that because that is such a big part of where I think, again, the story is going to go. But I think it's also maybe Alan Moore's looking at America, and America that, quote unquote, does the right thing and follows the rules. And it seems like there's something very, very important here where this story is going, that it might be not just a great story, but maybe it's a slight commentary on where America was at that time and where we are now.
Yeah, and that's
not to get too philosophical there.
No. I think you're right there, and that's another important passage. I'm glad that you pointed it out. And this is the kind of writing we come to expect from Moore, in that it's very dense, and there are sections that, just as you would doing some kind of literary critical analysis with, traditional prose, fiction, or even poetry, right? You would point to as key passages or as important passages that may provide a key to the larger narrative or a potential way of interpreting, everything that is going on here, something that may be thematically based or something that may be, some people may say, almost a giveaway to what this story is about. So, yeah, I think that's very good writing. Now, getting back to Alan Moore's writing, I don't want to say too much about the letter that ends this first issue. I said it was 3 pages. It's actually a 4-page letter. And what this is, it's an entry from Robert Black that he makes basically soon after the events of this first issue, as we leave off with his story. And I don't want to go into too much detail because that would start approaching spoiler territory, and I don't want to give anything away, even though I don't know how much is given away, right? Because there's still a gigantic question mark, for me at least, at the end of this first issue, as well it should be. But I mention this is because if they're trying to make a comparison, if people, I don't know if it's Alan Moore himself or the people at Avatar or whoever the hell wrote that solicit that appeared a couple of months ago in previews, in making the comparison to Watchmen, this is another instance where someone could say, hey, this is like Watchmen, because if you remember, the original 12 issues of Watchmen ended with, I got for the most part, a piece of prose. And these were sections from, a book that was being written, about the older superheroes, right? So there's something similar going on here, and I'm wondering if all of the subsequent issues in Providence will end with one of Robert's journal entries.
I wondered the same thing too, and we actually talked very recently about the use of prose in another book, Russian Olive to Red King, that I thought was used very effectively. I think it's effectively used here as well. I don't think it's just a device that's thrown in there. I think the creators here have taken a lot of thought and placed that into the story. It will be interesting to see if all the issues contain the same journal entries, and I can see where this could be a very powerful storytelling tool to use. Derek, I have a question that's been bothering me all day, and I'm going to ask you off mic about it, but it has to do with this journal entry. I don't want it to go on the show because again, we would be giving too much away, but I definitely want to hear your thoughts about it. But again, I think this is a very, very good first issue, and Derek, as you know, I don't buy a lot of single issues. I tend to wait for the trades to come out. I think I'm going to have to buy this in individual issues.
Yeah, I am too. Actually, I was wrong earlier when I said this may be 8 to 10 issues. It is going to be 12 issues. I just looked it up. Now, unless they changed things, maybe it is going to be 10, because I'm looking now at, well, no, it says this was posted March 5th of this year, so apparently this is going to be a 12-issue series. So yeah, but I think I know what you're going to ask me, and yeah, okay. I don't want to talk about this on air because again, we would be approaching spoiler territory. But yeah, I'm like you. I am going to read this in single issues, but I definitely want to look at the finished package when it comes out, when they're done. I guess maybe next year. Who knows? Or a year and a half from now.
Yeah. And Derek, I don't want to get too far off topic, but we talked a little bit about a good starting point for people that are unfamiliar with the work of Gilbert Hernandez, and I imagine most people that have read anything by Alan Moore have probably read Watchmen. And I know it's really early in this series, but could you recommend a good place for listeners who maybe have not read much Alan Moore or any Alan Moore? Maybe they've read Watchmen, and something else that would be a good jumping on place to experience more of Alan Moore.
More.
Yeah.
More. Okay, I'm sorry that I started to sing there.
I actually know the song that you're singing, so
yeah.
Dates me as well.
What was it? The Andre True connection?
Andrea True connection.
Andrea True connection. That's it. Boy, does that date us.
Yeah. Okay, we probably lost some listeners right there.
Yeah.
We probably have turned off the podcast.
Yeah. Disco sucks, man.
Yeah.
But I don't know, because I think Alan Moore is a different beast entirely from Gilbert Hernandez, in that you can basically start in many different places, or you can start many different places with Gilbert Hernandez. But I think the kind of writer that Alan Moore is, and also the kind of artist that he works with, just makes him different. I mean, I think someone could easily start with Watchmen. You can also start with the League of Extraordinary Gentlemen. You can start with his Superman stuff. Definitely you could start with his Swamp Thing stories. So I think that for the most part, wherever you start with Alan Moore is fine. It makes sense to me. I think someone, if they've never read any Alan Moore at all, and not just, Alan Moore's Lovecraft stuff, but any Alan Moore, from this first issue of Providence, I can see where someone could begin reading this and not really have to have the kind of backstory of what Alan Moore has done previously. So I think that this may be a good starting point. Although someone who hasn't read any Alan Moore or who hasn't heard of Alan Moore, that would be hard to believe.
It would be hard to believe, and again, I didn't mean to put you on the spot, but coming, this is coming from somebody that hasn't read all that much Alan Moore. But I know that we may have some listeners out there that you hear Alan Moore and Watchmen and everything, and you think, okay, what else is there what should be next? So, but yeah, I appreciate you answering that question.
Yeah, sure. I mean, I think his League of Extraordinary Gentlemen stuff is just great. If someone wanted to pick up Providence and just begin from there, maybe the only thing they have read is Watchmen. Hey, that would work as well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, so I really liked this first issue. I think we're in total agreement on that.
Yes. So we started off with Gilbert Hernandez's Grip, The Strange World of Men, coming out from Dark Horse. Then we discussed Little Nemo, Return to Slumberland, published through IDW, written by Eric Shanower and drawn by Gabriel Rodriguez. In fact, fantastically drawn by Rodriguez. And then we concluded with a discussion of Alan Moore and Jacen Burrows' Providence #1 from Avatar Press. So 3 very different but 3 very good titles that we discussed this week. Andy?
Yes. Great titles here. You can't go wrong. Again, Derek, very, very different. And again, we've got 2 iconic creators here, Gilbert Hernandez, Alan Moore, and an iconic title, Nemo, Little Nemo.
Yeah, I like what you did there because that's the way you opened this show and that's the way you end. So you provided a bit of closure. Thank you, my friend.
You're welcome.
Yeah, and if you want to find out what the next issues of Providence are all about, as we do, then you can pre-order your copies through our sponsor, and that is Discount Comic Book Service. Go to their website, dcbservice.com, and you can pre-order not only issues 2, 3, 4, and so on of Providence, but also a ton of other comics. They got great deals, and you can't go wrong with those guys. And after you do pre-order your comics there, get in touch with us and let us know the kind of things that you're going to be reading. If you go to our website, comicsalternative.com, you'll see a tab on the right-hand side of your browser. Click on that, and from the comfort of your own desktop or mobile device, you can send us a message through the wonders of SpeakPipe. Or you can call us the old-fashioned way. Our phone number is 415-3-COMICS. That's 415-326-6427.
And if you want to keep up with everything that's going on in the Comics Alternative universe, the best way to do that is to follow us on Twitter. We are at the number 2 guys with PhDs. And thanks once again for everybody who favors and retweets our tweets.
That's right. We appreciate that. You can also email us. We're 2guys@comicsalternative.com, or you can contact me directly. I'm Derek at comicsalternative.com. And Andy, how can they get in touch with you?
You can contact me at wolverton@comicsalternative.com.
That's right. You can also find us on Facebook, on Tumblr, on Instagram, and on Google. We also have a YouTube channel. You can subscribe to the podcast through iTunes. You can stream us on Stitcher. You can also listen to us through TuneIn. But you can find every single one of our episodes, as well as our reviews and comics-related commentaries that we post on our blog. And that's at comicsalternative.com.
That's right. There's lots of ways to find us, and we hope you take advantage of whichever are the best for you.
Yeah, get in touch with us those ways or join on the forum. We just like hearing from you guys, so please do get in touch. And until then, I'm Derek.
And I'm Andy.
We'll see you later.
Quaker Oats. It's the right thing to do.